what I want to tell you about really is how it all began and then how it moved on from there. And it began with a letter from a lawyer called Christopher Harmer to me at Jesus College, where Jane and I were then living, and he said that he represented a person, by implication a person of means, who was, would be interested in archaeology and perhaps in helping the archaeology department, and could he visit us? And he didn't disclose in the letter the name of the potential benefactor. In fact, the name was blanked out in one or two places, which gave a slight air of mystery to the enterprise. But it wasn't difficult to reply affirmatively to the letter, and so we arranged that the group of three should visit the department and have lunch in Jesus College. And so that's exactly what happened. Dr. McDonald, and as it turned out to be, and Christopher Harmer and his advisor Ken Mosley all came. This was, I think, in 1988, if I'm not mistaken, around the middle of the year 1988, and they came, and so Dr. McDonald came to lunch, and we had a very interesting conversation. He was a very lively man, showed great interest in all the details of the equipment of the department, the laboratories and so on, and then he had lunch with invited guests, including some of those here. He discussed the Paleolithic with Paul Mellors. He discussed Mesopotamia with Joan Oates, and I think David Oates was with us on one of these occasions. He met Anthony Snodgrass and others, and then he said, "Oh well, that's very interesting. This was after lunch. Thank you very much. Goodbye." And he left, and that was fine. But that was all we heard of it for a while. And then a few months later, I got a letter saying, well, from Christopher Harmer saying, "Can I and Ken Mosley come and call on you again?" And nothing much had happened. So this time they were offered coffee and biscuits in the department. And they arrived and said, well, Dr. McDonald was very interested, and he would like to offer you for the department £100,000 a year for 5 years. And can you indicate how you would dispose of a larger sum? Now, you can see that was a very good question. And so I thought about that very good question, and I did have the idea that we needed a building, we needed an institute, and we needed, above all, we needed laboratories. And so I already had that thought. So after I'd had this positive discussion, I contacted Ken Edwards, who was the Secretary General of the faculties, and there'd been a misfortune with the previous benefactor, I was told, where the university hadn't been very quick on its feet and hadn't really got itself organised and been very welcoming. So that mistake was certainly not made on this occasion. Ken Edwards was very dynamic. He thought, well, there's that space, which was a car park where we are now, so he asked, I think, David Todd Jones, a consultant of estate management, and an architect was commissioned. I don't remember the name of that first architect, but he did a sketch of what an institute might look in this location. When Dr. McDonald came again, and he was quite keen to come soon, and I didn't really want him to come in term time when I was doing lots of other things and so on, and he became impatient, and indeed he nearly became irritated at our delays, but it was clearly better he should come in December when term had ended, and so he did come in December, and that's when we really did try and roll out the carpet, so to speak, in Jesus College. It was around Christmas, so the choir came dressed in their surplices and sang in Christmas carols, and there was a very fine reception, of which I can give you one or two memories. There's Chair Van Andel there, and this is Dr. Mack, that's Jane, of course. And here are various distinguished people. That is Ken Mosley, his advisor. I don't have a photo of Christopher Harmer, I'm afraid, and you'll recognise many of the other people there. And so we were all keen to talk to Dr. Mack and fill him with enthusiasm. And out of that, really, came the notion of what the Institute should be, which is a very wide-ranging Institute, and the suggestion arose, yes, we did want a building, and it should be an institute, and naturally it should be the McDonald Institute, so that's how the whole idea arose, and matters went ahead from there, and it was, I think, in 1990, and I'm not going to talk about a very interesting visit some of us had to Dr. McDonald's homeland in Fort William, to Inverlochy, but that may be mentioned by a later speaker. But we had a proper signing, and there's the Vice-Chancellor there, Michael McCrum, the Vice-Chancellor at that time, and other persons, and we had a formal signing when the notion of a McDonald Institute was established. And his advisors, Ken Mosley and Christopher Harmer, were very helpful. They knew his personality, that he was a man who liked to focus on things, and they said you should get it up and running as soon as you can. He will be willing to support that. And so we looked for premises. In fact, Dr. McDonald helped us look for premises, and we found some suitable premises, and he said, no, those are not good enough. Then we found some good premises above Boots the chemist in Sydney Street, 62 Sydney Street, and so there is what the Nucleus Institute consisted of: the McDonald Grants and Awards Fund, then a number of projects, the McDonald Lecture, which we set up at once, the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, which Chris Scarr may no doubt talk about, was the first editor of, lunchtime seminars, the first McDonald Conference, and the monographs. We commissioned the portrait of Dr. Mack, which you see on the back wall behind you now, and he saw the portrait, and he was not a man always generous in his praise, but he muttered something about, I suppose, do or something, and that was high praise from Dr. Mack. The theme, really, of the McDonald Institute in the early years, and perhaps still, is cognitive archaeology, which very much reflected the interests of the doctor, and so here are some of the early volumes. That volume there was published by Cambridge University Press because we didn't at that time have a series of McDonald monographs, otherwise it would have been the first McDonald monographs. And here are others on that theme, and others again. And so there is the Illicit Antiquities Research Centre, and there are the various issues of Culture Without Context, which was a polemical journal, and there is Stealing History, which was a polemical publication, and I hope Jenny will say a little about those things. And then here is the Archaeogenetics Laboratory, and Peter Forster will speak about that, and there are his early collaborators, and there indeed are early publications in that direction. And then another thing we did was have a series of conferences on the prehistory of languages, and the Nostratic Dictionary was one of the great products of that, and there are some of the other early projects there. And then, of course, the McDonald Institute monographs, which is perhaps one of the most important products of the Institute, were edited and production edited by Chris and Dora, and there are some of the early monographs. And there, in conclusion, is a nice picture of Dr. Mack. He was a kindly man at times, and a jovial man occasionally, and that, I think, shows him to good advantage. So thank you very much.
Dr. Mack, as we all called him, was a man of such insight and versatility that he could have, and in fact more or less did, succeed in a whole array of different careers. Dr. Mack the engineer, Dr. Mack the entrepreneur, Dr. Mack the philanthropist, Dr. Mack the seriously learned student of the human past. All of these personae came to fulfillment. Only perhaps Dr. Mack, the qualified doctor of medicine, was kept in reserve as a sort of extra string to his bow. Now, as a West Highlander, born and raised in Fort William, Glasgow was the natural destination for him as his university of first choice, and so it proved. He achieved a first-class degree in engineering there in the later 1920s. The next phase of his life he used by taking a second degree in medicine at Birmingham, simultaneously with building up and establishing an initially small business there, Birmingham Sound Reproducers. Founded in 1932, it was to enjoy its greatest success after World War II in the production of record players that could select and play the 3 different sizes of vinyl record that were then available. Many, many years ago, for my 21st birthday, I was given a turntable, or a player incorporating a BSR turntable. The demand for these products held up until the appearance of the cassette player, the CD and the Walkman, and BSR did close in 1985. But by then, Dr. Mack had long been in a position not just to make a series of generous charitable gifts to galleries and museums, but also to pursue his long-standing interest in especially one branch of the human past, metrology. Now, this was very timely because at that moment, more or less, Colin and others were more or less in the act of inventing cognitive archaeology. Now, this did not mean excluding the prehistoric past. As everyone here knows, astronomical observations and their product in terms of calendars, along with discoveries of engraved linear scales and sets of weights, have come to light in recent times and take these things back as far as the 3rd millennium BC at least. Dr. Mack dug deeply into the records of these advances, and it was right that Chris Scarr was able to produce and edit for the Institute the first publication of the fruits of these investigations in the book, The Origins of Metrology, though sadly, as Colin said, it appeared only after his death. One of his themes was the historical priority of the inch-foot system in geometry, and another one, the priority of the number of 30 in arithmetic, across cultures who were never in touch with each other and who must therefore have developed them independently. One of my favorite pieces in the book is the one called "Why Archaeologists Should Continue to Use the Inch-Foot System." The answer being that for almost anywhere in antiquity, this will yield rational numbers for what they discover instead of the irrational ones produced by using the metric system. Most intriguing of all is his demonstration that close correspondences up to this standard of accuracy in non-metric system measurement could be traced over 2.5 millennia in the Old World, from Sumer and Akkad, by way of Achaemenid Persia, then early modern England, then the 19th century Habsburg Empire, ending up in the modern Bureau of Standards of the USA. But how? Characteristically, Dr. Mack left it to the reader to think out answers. I end by reverting to another of Dr. Mack's qualities, his perhaps not so patent but very, very real generosity. In November 1989, he entertained the Renfrews, the Mellerses and the Snodgrasses for several days in the luxurious Inverlochy Castle Hotel, which he had had reopened specially after it closed for the winter for this event. It was November, but the sun shone. Little or no business was discussed, but the atmosphere was so congenial that a favourable outcome seemed to follow naturally, as indeed it did the very following month, with Dr. Mack's next and I think decisive visit in person to Cambridge, as described by Colin. I hope you can forgive my indulgence here in nostalgia, but these early contacts became the more precious when Dr. McDonald's death deprived him of a site of the Institute, complete in physical form, as indeed of his book, as indeed of the first number of the CAJ, as it deprived us of his wise guidance. I've always treasured one of his favourite departing phrases whenever we had just fixed the date for our next meeting. F were spared. Maybe he meant it more seriously than we took it. And the fact is that it was only little more than a year later that, after the events I've described, that he was gone from us. We were left to attend his funeral in the Isle of Man, to welcome his widow in his place, to the foundation stone ceremony in 1992, and to the opening in 1994. But few of us can leave so lasting a monument as he has.
Thank you.
Okay, Colin has already emphasised that Dr. MacDonald had widespread interests ranging over all periods, and particularly things connected with the development of human cognition, intelligence, and so on. From some of the earliest discussions I had with him in Jesus College, over dinner and elsewhere, it emerged that one virtual obsession in his mind was about the Neanderthals, which is an obsession which some other of us have shared over the years, and particularly the sloping brow ridges and forehead of the Neanderthals, which he pointed out would impinge on the size of the frontal lobe and this part of the brain. And his idea, which I listened to with interest, but at the time with no particular conviction, that might have limited the intelligence of the Neanderthals, or as some people have sometimes said, raised the question of whether Neanderthals 2 sandwiches short of a picnic, which I've increasingly come, although it would take long to explain, is probably the truth. I think they were challenged in that direction. But the point is, even though I wasn't dismissive to him, I listened with great interest, but I didn't take it too seriously. The point is that later research has brought a lot of support to that idea, because the frontal lobe, which presumably was compressed in Neanderthals, less voluminous, is the area where most of the imaginative, forward-looking, strategic thinking is located in the human brain. So, in fact, at that point, I started remembering his arguments about that and taking them more seriously. Dr. MacDonald came to inspect at some point, again Chris would know when, how this proto-institute was functioning, and we all wanted to create the best impression, so he was going to go around all the laboratories, and Petra had quite a substantial laboratory for the Starkile work, and I didn't quite insist, but I strongly suggested that she should wear a white coat so that she looked like a real laboratory worker. You know, this was real hard science. And eventually she gave in, and Dr. MacDonald was impressed by Petra, as he should have been, but then his eyes lighted on the microscope she was using for pollen analysis, which had been lent to us by the Department of Botany, or Plant Sciences here, and said on the bottom of it, property of the Department of Plant Sciences. And Dr. MacDonald said, I don't remember the exact words, something to the effect that, what, a borrowed instrument in my my research institute, my dear, you shall have the best microscope that money can buy. And he went on to buy a Rolls Royce, I can't remember whether it was a Leitz or a Leica, binocular microscope with full photographic attachments, which I assume and hope is now housed in the Pitt Rivers.
He's still doing good service.
I'm going to give you a flavour in the next 10 or 11 minutes about the kinds of projects that my colleagues and I did in the early years of the McDonald Genetics Laboratory. Let's see, that's that works. So much of the work is focused on two genetic systems. There's the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down to the children from the mother only, and then there is the Y chromosome, which is passed down from the father to his sons. And these two genetic systems allow us separately to look at male prehistory and at female prehistory, which is relevant, for example, if you want to distinguish a military adventure, including only male soldiers, from, for example, a real colonization event, which would include entire families. So when I arrived here, I was actually coming from forensic genetics, and someone had tipped off the BBC, and they came here and did the first filming by the BBC in the Molecular Genetics Laboratory in April 2000. And what they were interested in was a project where they wanted to trace the ancestry of African Caribbeans. So we did over 200 samples from African Caribbeans and found out which parts of Africa their lineages would have come from when they were captured as slaves centuries ago. And because people in police forces saw this documentary, I was then contacted by several different police forces in the country who had bodies. They wanted to know where these bodies had come from. And this is one you might remember. This is the Thames torso, so a black boy who was fished out of the Thames River without arms and legs. And the police originally thought the body might be from South Africa. And then we did the DNA analysis and found out, in fact, it is a West African type, and therefore also possibly Caribbean and connected to voodoo practices, possibly explaining the mutilation. Okay, so but that is just the beginning. What we were really interested in was deep prehistory in humans leading up to the present time. I got up, I think, in summer 2001 morning out of bed, and it suddenly struck me, based on our analyses, that that humans left Africa as one group 60,000 years ago. Not several waves, not longer ago at that point in time. And the method that we use to achieve this is called the phylogenetic network method I developed with colleagues, the software, which we applied to modern data to reconstruct prehistoric evolutionary trees. So we know where people come from, we know what times they arrive, and from that we can calculate how fast they were moving. So this migration from Africa to Australia, for example, moved at a speed of more than a mile a year. So they got over there in less than 5,300 years. Now that is quite fast, because within Africa, at the same time, people were moving from east to west, to the first modern humans over there, at only a speed of 200 to 300 meters a year. So this mover is about 5 times faster. I don't know why. I presume it's because they were capable of seafaring, which they would have needed anyway to get across to Australia. What we'd really like to know next is how many people moved, and this is where Colin Renfrew and Matt Hurls, our first postdoc, came to the rescue. They secured, I think, a $200,000 Templeton grant, and from that we funded Shuichi Matsumura, who is the gentleman in blue here, and he's an expert for computer simulation, and he can calculate population sizes. And the first such application was to Madagascar. We published this with Bob Dewar. He was one of the fellows here in the McDonald, husband of the Vice Chancellor at the time, and I think he died sadly about 2 years ago. Yes. So Bob is an expert, or was an expert, on Malagasy archaeology, and he told us all we needed to know. And for example, Madagascar, as you know, the language comes from Borneo, and we confirmed that in the DNA. Half the DNA actually comes from Southeast Asia, not from Africa, so they must have made it across there, and that would have been about 2,000 years ago. So Shuichi applied his computational magic and entered the genetic variation we see today in Madagascar to find out how many people moved across there in 2,000 years ago. and this is the answer, about 70 people, so this effective population size 30, so about 70 people moved from Borneo to Madagascar. And Bob, you explained to me that's possible. You'd need about 3 outrigger canoes, 10 tons of cargo, and about 6 weeks of traveling to do the trip. Okay, most of what I said was mitochondrial DNA. Y chromosomal DNA, to begin with, was a bit more difficult. There were, in the early 2000s, about 6-7 research groups doing pioneering work on the Y chromosome, but all their publications were unintelligible because each of them used their own nomenclature. So the group in California would call their type, let's say, type C for that particular Y chromosome, and the group in Italy would call it type 3.5, and in Leicester they'd call it something else. And so it was very confusing. And luckily I had a couple of £1,000 left over from a travel grant. And so we invited all these groups to come right here. So they sat at the table just here. And we said, we're not leaving the room until we've agreed on a unified nomenclature. And so we did. And this is the result of it. And the paper was published in 2002 and has been used thousands and thousands of times. So I think that was financially the most effective paper published. So a lot of bang for the buck. Going on with the Y chromosome, Colin Renfrew asked me a few years ago whether I would like to contribute to the Cambridge World Prehistory, an encyclopedia encompassing archaeology, genetics and linguistics. And so I trawled through the most recent literature and found, to my surprise, quite a nice correlation between Y chromosome and language change. And this is one of the things that come out of that particular work. And it is a bit surprising because we think of learning languages from our mother and call it mother tongue in most languages. The only language which doesn't say mother tongue is Polish. They call it father tongue. But otherwise, that was a bit of a surprising correlation to find that in prehistory, we're talking about, say, replacement of Khoisan language with Bantu or with Dravidian languages with Indo-European and so forth, that it is a minimum number of males immigrating which are required to change a language, whereas the number of females immigrating does not show any correlation. When you talk about languages, you also want to consider horses. This is because there are people who believe that languages were spread with horses, the Kurgan theory, and so on. And so one of the projects that Colin Renfrew and I and several others did was to look at horse genetics, and here we find that the native pony breeds that we find in the British Isles, in Scandinavia, all the way across to Central Asia, are all from the same genetic stock. So that was puzzling because ponies as such only means a small horse. It's not a breed as such, but we find that in these northern latitudes across half the world, these ponies did arise from one common origin, and they've been here since the Ice Age.
Okay, in 1998, rather to my astonishment, I was appointed as the research assistant at the fledgling Illicit Antiquities Research Centre at the McDonald Institute. The name of the centre and the term illicit antiquities was deliberately opaque, for of course it covered objects which were illegally excavated and exported from their countries of origin, but were not at that time illegal under UK law. The logo for the new centre, suggested by Augusta MacMahon and designed by Dora Kemp, was the symbol for the Mesopotamian sun god Shamash, who travelled all-seeing through the sky and was therefore responsible for truth and justice. When I arrived, Neil and I went through the mission statement that had been set up for the IRC. I don't know who wrote this, but it was quite a big mission statement. It basically said, change the world. And Neil and I had to quickly narrow that down into what we felt were the priorities. And this is what we decided: to assess, to draw attention to the trade, to trace and make known specific examples of where the trade was operating, and to disseminate information and use it wherever we could to change policy. Information on the trade was then, and for researchers in the field still is, difficult to come by. But we did have access to archaeologists from around the world, and we asked them for any information they could provide about archaeological looting in their areas. And we met many people involved in fighting the illicit trade along the way. We worked with law enforcement officers, museum and heritage workers, politicians, convicted smugglers, lawyers, customs officials. We collected any photographs, and these were physical photographs in those days, which were sent to us from all around the world. We collected any anecdotes, and we soon built up substantial news and photographic archives. We built up a lot of information about collectors too, from different sources. From economic publications, we logged massive runs of auction sales to try and make correlations between museum acquisitions and collectors. We found examples of illicit antiquities everywhere, from hotel brochures to Hello magazine. Some collectors were very conveniently would publish their illicit antiquities for them, so we could see them in their natural surroundings. Some museums would even publish, advertise, like the National Gallery of Australia when they'd acquired a new dodgy object, and then sometimes we could even call them up on it in the press. We built up a fantastic network of people. We'd routinely get calls from a wonderful constable at Heathrow when he would find something that he thought looked a bit dodgy, and then he'd give us a ring and we'd be like, yeah, it probably is a bit dodgy. Now you could do it all by mobile phone, but it was a little bit more awkward in those days. As part of our remit, we were required to publish a biannual newsletter called Culture Without Context. We published any usable information that we had in Culture Without Context, from whole plunder blunders to news snippets to academic analyses. It was designed by Dora Kemp, and we tried to make it look like an accessible magazine. We pulled in articles from archaeologists, heritage workers, police forces and informed individuals from around the world. Peter Watson would write up ongoing stages of his investigations for the newsletter. Everyone was keen to actually name names, so whatever we wrote was read by London libel lawyers before going to press, so that we were covered by the university insurance. Nevertheless, we became used to receiving threatening letters from lawyers around the world, acting for collectors, dealers and institutions all over the world. The trade magazine Minerva tended to make very personal comments. They even stated at one time that Professor Renfrew had clearly lost his marbles. And we were called the Hezbollah of archaeology by various American journalists. One London dealer charmingly told me at an event that Neil and I were the last thing he expected Cambridge University to tolerate, a Scouser and a woman. No one ever actually sued Neil or I. I usually libelled more people than Neil in Culture Without Context, but we both quickly learned how far we could safely go. Culture Without Context was distributed in hard copy to paying subscribers, and it was freely available on our worldwide website, which was quite unusual in those days. It was identified as one of the most visited areas of the whole university online enterprise at the time. It attracted traffic from an unusually wide international range, which pleased them for diversity figures, and it quickly became the go-to source for information about the illicit trade. 1999 was also a busy year for us because Neil, Peter and I won a tender from the Museums Association UK to write a report on the illicit trade. They wanted to use a report as a lobbying tool to get the government to sign the UNESCO Convention. And because its refusal to sign was becoming an embarrassment and an issue for museums as well as the archaeological world. We called the report Stealing History, and again we designed it to incorporate every little bit of information we had laid our hands on. It was aimed at MPs and journalists, and we deliberately wrote it in an accessible, slightly sensational style, and again designed it to look almost like a magazine. We ended it at the Museum Association's request with a series of hard-hitting recommendations for the UK government. For libel reasons, it was published by the Museums Association, but under the auspices of the McDonald Institute in 2000. The time was right. We faxed a draft to the actor Tony Robinson's agent. He was then at the height of his Time Team fame, and he phoned me the next day to say he'd love to speak at the launch, and he was a little bit shirty when I thought he was Neil playing a joke on me. Professor Renfrew and Tony Robinson were joined by Lyndall Prott, the head of cultural standards at UNESCO, and Manus Brinkman, the head of the International Council of Museums, at the press launch for Stealing History in Westminster in 2000. They formed an expert panel and answered specific questions to the 100+ journalists who attended the event. The report sold in thousands and generated massive media coverage. And as the journalists followed up the stories contained in it for themselves in a way that we were unable to do from an office in Cambridge, they quickly identified provable links between the illicit trade in antiquities, between smuggling and money laundering and arms smuggling. The weight of information in stealing history and the subsequent media storm made it impossible to argue that there was a problem. After stealing history, no one, even in the trade, denied that there was a problem. But the new Labour government, which had stated its intention to sign the UNESCO Convention when it was in opposition, had backtracked after they won the election. And we challenged them on this, Neil and Professor Renfrew, and there were other MPs and peers and archaeologists and organisations, I should say, applying pressure as well. But they always came up with the fact that there were legal impediments, and these seemed to revolve around the requirement in the convention that you had to have a list of protected antiquities in order to sign up. And the government said that this list would be basically too costly to produce and impossible to produce, they felt. Neil, who by now knew more about government policies than the government did and was working full-time at Illicit Antiquities, came up with a solution so simple that at first we discounted it. That we list categories of objects rather than the objects themselves, and this list already existed in the UK for export purposes, export control purposes. UNESCO agreed, and Professor Renfrew went head-to-head with Alan Howarth, the Secretary of State, on Newsnight. Jeremy Paxman was a bit disappointed because there wasn't a scrap. Alan Howarth just agreed straight away, said he'd set up a parliamentary panel. He did. They issued a couple of reports, and the UNESCO Convention was signed. Looking back, it seems to me that it was a bold and rather risky move for the steering group of the McDonald Institute to set up the Illicit Antiquities Research Centre. But I think the gamble paid off. Its success and the international scope of the work and the high press profile put the Institute on the map around the world. Those of us involved during that period have the privilege of knowing that we did manage to change things, even if, as evidenced by the news this week and indeed this morning, history continues to repeat itself.
So I was asked today to talk about creating the role of the Deputy Director and to say something about publications. And in fact, what I'll say will divide into three sections or three themes overlapping. The initial foundation, where I'll just say a little bit about how it all came about, and some of that you've already heard from Colin and Anthony. Then a little bit about publications, and then specifically about the development of the role of Deputy Director. So looking back to the very beginning, over 25 years, I've got a lot of kind of snapshot memories of what happened, but it's actually quite difficult to put them in a reliable sequence. But two of the very first steps I do recall is the establishment in 1989 of what was the D.M. McDonald Grants and Awards Fund, and this is the fund that Colin mentioned where Dr. McDonald offered 5 years funding in the first instance for projects. And that began in 1989, and then in the same year we had the first McDonald Lecture, and this became an annual event, a lecture in November generally I think, followed by dinner, and it was the major event of the Institute's year. The first lecture was given in November 1989, and given Dr. McDonald's interest in cognitive matters in archaeology, cognitive archaeology generally, we invited Alexander Marshak to talk about Paleolithic art, and particularly about measurement and counting. And the result of this eventually was an article that was published in the first issue of the Cambridge Archaeological Journal about this Thai plaque from southwest France with various markings that may be a lunar notation. And of course that relates very closely to Dr. McDonald's interest in early systems of weights and measures and numeration. And of course it was that interest that really, I think, brought Dr. McDonald to be interested in archaeology and into the idea of founding the McDonald Institute. So officially, I think we were founded in May 1990. I think that's when the notice is published in the Reporter, reporting that the the university had given an official agreement to the foundation, but of course at that stage we had no premises. So one of the first tasks that I was faced with was trying to find temporary accommodation in which to house the few projects that we then had and to serve as a launch pad for the institute. And I do recall on one of Dr. McDonald's early visits, we lined up 2 or 3 premises in Cambridge to go and visit, to rent for a few years. And I remember taking him by car with Philip Plant around central Cambridge, which I don't think you could do today, visiting 2 or 3 premises. And what we ended up with was the offices that have been mentioned at 62 Sydney Street, which is just on the 2nd floor above where Boots the Chemist's is, or certainly was. So alongside that, as Deputy Director, I was involved with the arrangements for with the administration of the building, with the negotiations with the university for detailed running of the buildings, and with the move to these new premises. But also a very important part of the role was to do with publications. Yes, so Dr. McDonald had been very keen from a very early stage that we should launch a new archaeology journal to reflect the particular interests of the McDonald Institute in the development of early human cognition. And this eventually saw the light of day as the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, the first issue in April 1991. One feature of the journal is its size, its format, and Dr. McDonald was particularly adamant that the page size should be US letter format, or USA4, which is slightly shorter, 216 by 279, as opposed to European or worldwide non-North American A4, which is taller and broader. And this just shows, I just mention this as an indication of his detailed involvement in the planning of the journal and in its arrangements. And in fact, Steve Myven and I were sent off on a fact-finding mission to the US to visit various publishers of archaeology journals to see how things should be and would be done. So the first issue appeared in 1991, published by Cambridge University Press, but the timing was rather sad. In fact, it was only a few weeks earlier that Dr. McDonald, I think it was the very end of February, Dr. McDonald had paid his last visit to Cambridge, and in the first issue we were obliged to then to have a short obituary notice recording that he died shortly before this first issue was published. And the first issue of CAJ was dedicated to his memory. Launching a new journal, of course, isn't an easy task, and the first issue was fortunately supported by contributions from the home team, as we see here. But we very soon built up strength, and of course it's gone on to be a great success, and is certainly one of the leading archaeology journals today, I think it's fair to say. Another significant early publication we've already heard about was Dr. McDonald's own collected papers, The Origins of Metrology. Now, I was involved in detailed discussions with him about these from almost the very beginning of our contact with him, and it was always the plan to publish them, and eventually this didn't happen until after his death again, but we did publish these in 1992, and the contents show you his interest was, of course, in weights and measures, and in the idea that the pre-metric weights and measures system was derived from a system of weights and measures that ultimately went back to origins in the Mediterranean and Near East. So this became the first monograph publication of the McDonald Institute, and it was a few years before we decided that we would launch a complete series of monographs. And this is where I really have to pay tribute, very sadly, to Dora Kemp, who was a mainstay of this operation throughout the time. I think she came on board as a part-time editorial assistant for the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 1991, or possibly 1990. She was amazingly efficient and effective and dedicated, and it was really through her support and through what we'd seen that she could do that we had confidence that we could launch the monograph series, because whereas the journal was published in collaboration with Cambridge University Press, the monographs were published by us. We arranged the printing and distribution and everything in the design, everything in-house. So that demanded quite a wide range of skills, and Dora either possessed or developed very many of those. And you will see outside there is a great range of monographs, a great series of monographs that have appeared with her involvement. By the time these monographs began to appear, this was in 1996, these two first monographs appeared, we were well established in the new buildings on the Downing site here and in the west building opposite. Now the new premises are very splendid and were very splendid in many respects, but of course new buildings are always a headache in certain respects. And I don't think I've ever heard a case of a building project which manages to come to fruition without some kind of difficulties. So this was probably no worse than usual, but I distinctly remember problems of moving into the building, problems of getting the shelving in place in time. We were moving into a building without shelves, which of course is extremely difficult. And above all, the mystery of the copper piping, which in the upper floors of this building began to spring a whole series of pinhole leaks a few weeks or a few months after we moved in, and in a rather mysterious pattern that I still don't quite understand, but it had to be stripped out and replaced.
We've heard a fair bit about the rooms above Boots, and then we moved to this building, and I want to just share a few reflections on the design of this building by Michael Caine and its design as a space for a lot of scientific activity, and there's other things going on, of course, but that's my patch. I'm delighted David Todd Jones is here, who was head of estate management at the time, but it means I can't make up as much of it as I might have. But anyway, what I want to do is start at the top of the building and the pepper pot, which is a very striking feature, and it's enormous. And what it means to me as the scientist working the building is it's a sign this building has terrific lungs, and it has the best lungs of any building on the site. And I'll say a bit more about this, about how those. If you are a scientist, I mean, people think about science as very kind of fancy machines and so forth. Science is largely about getting a lot of messy stuff into a building and getting a lot of even messier stuff out of the building. And that's why, for me, a laboratory building is like an organism, and this building is particularly like an organism. So it has these great lungs down the middle with that pepper pot at the top. And up in the top, as we heard from a great talk from Peter, at the top there's the cleanest and lightest space with all this very intelligent activity going on. And then below that, in the middle of the building, there's a bit messier space where we do a lot of work on food. And as you go below the second floor, things get progressively darker and dirtier until by the time we get into the basement, there's the stuff of mystery. But the whole building, in fact, works very much like an organism, and because it's got great lungs, we will, in the future, we will see many forms of science going on in this building that we haven't even imagined now. But I hopefully predict that when we do, we won't see that sort of varicose veins of metallic spaghetti you see around buildings that haven't been designed as well as this one has for science. Now, to talk a bit more about the design, and I want to talk relate it both to the great contribution of the architect Michael Caine and Dr. McDonald. But to explain what's special about this building, I want to contrast it to another laboratory in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, and without question, historically the most important laboratory within the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, and one in which our dear friends, the social anthropologists, have been squatting for the last 40 years, and that's the old Cavendish Laboratory. Now, those of you who haven't thought about it as a building, it's very well worth walking through the archway, having a good look at the back wall, and then walking through the archway and having a good look at the front wall. And then you see this building that was constructed in 1874 set the model for laboratories of the 20th century all over the world. And before you go through the archway, you look at the back, and what you see is a box factory. And then you go through the archway and look back and see what you see as a college facade. They're completely different, and that's precisely what was designed at the old Cavendish. And if you look at laboratories around the world, they're all largely a rather simplistic box with a rather swanky facade. And that is the standard design of laboratories around the world. And before I came here, like anybody in my field, I've been involved in putting out some labs, and I too created labs out of boxes with not exactly a swanky facade, but a slightly pretentious facade. And one of the reasons why most labs are like that is, well, when I was in Durham, doing that in what Chris will remember as the Dawson building, I was working within, I think it was University Grants Council funding constraints, and so there's a price per square metre that you spend on labs, which more or less means you've got to create a box or work with a box. And in this building, the Dr. McDonald, who you've heard about his own deep engagement with the building, he decided to double that figure because he wanted he wanted a proper building. And so there are some conspicuous signs in the building that the price per metre was double the normal for a lab at the time, like the nice flooring and so forth. But for me, one of the aspects is that ducting that's in there. There's great columns of space that you don't really notice as you go up the stairs or up the lift, which is so important in terms of the flexibility of this building for laboratories. It's already been alluded to that we had some, shall we say, critical friends in both earth sciences and plant sciences, and some senior members in both departments who had different views about whether a very large building should go up in the middle of what then was there's a already dreadful building here and some tarmac and so forth. And so that was something that we had to, or other colleagues around the room, had to negotiate with some care. And one of the, very nice guy, but quite vocal on this point, was the late Tom Rees, who was a professor in plant sciences. And he was pretty, he was pretty straight up. He wasn't a devious guy, but he had a problem with what we might be building here, and was reasonably vocal about it. And as things were going, as the project was unfolding, I met him one day in the courtyard there, and he was standing there looking around, and the building was up and so forth, and he said to me, "Martin, this is quite nice, isn't it? It's not bad at all, I quite like it." And the interesting, I knew why he was saying that. He didn't quite work out what he particularly liked, and I knew from talking with Michael, what had changed his view was the £500,000 the project had spent beneath his feet. And that York paving out there is the thing that changed the perception of our neighbours of what it was like to be in this courtyard. So he's looking around and thinking about why was this nice, and it was actually the paving beneath his feet. And that to me is exactly how Michael Caine worked, not by creating another box with a fabulous facade, but creating, you know, a building with an eccentric pepper pot on top that I can say, as someone who's had the great privilege of doing science in this building for a quarter of a century, works extremely well. So.
The McDonald, the social side of archaeology, was the first thing that was ever said to me by in my first supervision by somebody called John Collis, who many people know. And I think, the McDonald has given a heart to this subject at Cambridge in a way that has been one of the most profound contributions. Coming down to the simplest thing of all, which is a place where Carol serves tea and coffee, and the tea and coffee that go with seminars and so on and all of that. So that social role, and the building is for staff, it's for postdocs, for PhDs. Without name, it wasn't on my first day. I said, well, MPhils here, and Chris said no real reason really. So MPhils were allowed in for coffee and functions from the first day. This was slightly to do with the fact that at the beginning, for VAT reasons, commoners were anxious to say this is a research building after a teaching building. And now, in fact, increasingly, it's also being seen as the base for the advanced undergraduates who are committing to the subject. There are something like 12 seminar groups now, so there are something like 100 seminars, or there were in my class, through terms, enormous range of seminars, in addition to all the conferences, workshops, the lab meetings. And it was really, that was the context where we had this major refurbishment, spending an extraordinary quantity of money for what we actually see a couple of years ago, which essentially was to enlarge this room and make the soundproofing much better. And so in a sense change the three spaces, which was the seminar room, the foyer and the coffee room, into broadly two spaces, which you can also turn more easily into one space. So that's been the context of it. Cambridge archaeologists have been working with major grants and with McDonald supporting them both in how to get the grants and running the grants. But the other side of what grants are about is people, postdocs. And I wasn't able to think how many postdocs have gone through the Institute in my time. But I know just from looking at the 2RE statements that 70 or 80 of them have gone on to more senior postdoctoral positions, and about 35 of them have gone on to permanent academic jobs of the group in my time. I've always said in some ways I think that's the finest statement really of what McDonald has achieved. Those lives, those transformed by being part of the Cambridge community. We're into the next phase, and it's Cyprian who's going to tell us about his thoughts there. So it was an amazing 10 years for me. I never thought it would happen in my career. I went into archaeology originally because I met Conor Renfrew when I was an undergraduate and he was a junior research fellow. And nobody could be more staggered that I ended up, well, impossibly following in his footsteps, but it was a different phase, and of McDonald, I'm really interested to hear what Cyprian will say.
As you know, in the past few months, there have been a few changes at the helm. And I really must start by thanking Graham very warmly for handing over the ship in such immaculate and vibrant condition, and to Colin too for his constant, if admirably restrained, support. It's marvellous to have you both here backing me when I need it. James Barrett, our Deputy Director, is on an enviable 3-year leave period to write his book on the archaeology of the Northern Seas in the Viking Age. And I really must express my immense gratitude to Simon Stoddart, who was, yes, he still is there, for stepping in to this role for 3 years. I'm not sure if he knew quite what he was stepping into. He had to make that offer again, but I'm warmly grateful, and we're both in over our necks already, so I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. The support team has really never been better. Sarah Harrop, Catherine Boyle, Emma Jarman, Laura James, our first-rate technical and support staff, although, of course, there is the gaping loss of Dora Kemp, whom none of us will ever forget. The record over the past quarter century has, if you've all seen, really been prodigious, whether we measure it in terms of theory building and interpretive archaeology, research and archaeological science, sheer numbers of conferences, publications, number of postdoctoral awards, and the raw grant income. The last most recently affirmed, and I think we can now announce this, by the fantastic news that Cameron Petrie has been awarded a €2 million grant from the ERC for a major project, the Two Rains project, on climate, water, social change, and the sustainability of farming in the Indus region. Now that's about €1 million per rain by my maths, and that's going to change a lot in this part of the world. And it's tremendous to see that, particularly being focused on the Indus Valley civilization, which is really in so many ways one of the last big question marks over the early pristine civilizations at the east of Old World Eurasia. Where do we go from here? Well, unsurprisingly, given my illustrious predecessors, there is an awful lot that, to put it mildly, manifestly ain't broke, and it would be, therefore, a big mistake to try to fix it. The procession of McDonald-appointed 3-year postdoctoral research fellows will continue the fine sequence set by those first in, as we heard, the field of cognitive archaeology, most recently Anniversary Awards, the 5th and final of which is now being advertised. And this is a really golden opportunity each year simply to try to do one of those wonderful things that anyone would want to do, to just select the cleverest, most brilliant, exciting new mind out there and bring them to Cambridge, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. This year we're welcoming Miljana Radovojevic, a foremost scholar of early Eurasian metallurgy. We'll be continuing the scheme. I think an upcoming tweak may be that we'll insist on a slightly shorter period between the award of the doctorate and the shove-off point to make sure it's fresh blood coming in. And also we're trying to forge new ties between the fellowship and particular colleges, so in a sense we can make it go further as a combined operation in terms of affiliation. More generally, you've heard from Graham about the extraordinary success and range of our postdoctoral community, and that remains one of the vibrant hearts of the Institute. But I am seriously concerned that we need, in this environment in particular, to actively help this new brilliant generation of archaeologists into a longer-term future. The exit route for our postdocs, wherever possible, should not be into another serial postdoc. it should be into a permanent university position or equivalent. That's usually the best for them. It's, after all, the ultimate validation of the correctness of our initial choice, and it should help to reshape the field of archaeology in general. Following the loss of Dora, we inevitably face a challenge, but beyond the hopeless task of replacing the unique, which we can never do, this is clearly the moment for a rethink. The Cambridge Archaeological Journal goes from strength to strength under the editorship of John Robb and his team, now up to 4 issues a year. The monographs still fill a valuable function, and we hope to spice up the series from the junior level by offering a publication to the best Cambridge PhD in archaeology each year. But really most pressing now is not the message, but the medium. We've just taken the decision under the guidance of Simon, and still I think we too will be making an exploratory visit to various parts of the world to discover how they do it there, as Chris described earlier for the initial phase of the publication programme. We've just made the decision to go decisively rather than wimpily and timidly online, and to put the McDonald in the vanguard of the drive to universal open access to knowledge. And that means that our future publications will be free to view online, very cheap to download, and they'll be backed by a small number of printed hard copies. In a sense, the anthropology of the gift is something eternal. We're always going to need those hard copies. And you will be able to print additional copies on demand. Another immediate initiative that we're starting is to kickstart fresh debates through a series of distinguished visiting lectureships. These are going to be 1-week intensive visits, termly for the foreseeable future, by an internationally renowned archaeologist to deliver 1 or 2 big lectures, seminars, workshops, but I think most importantly, simply to talk to people. Staff, undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs. The initial emphasis, I think, is going to be partly on rebuilding, I think, what's become a little bit of a gap between the upcoming generation of North American archaeologists and us on this side of the Atlantic divide in Europe. From here, of course, onto the blue skies, the challenge for all of us here at the McDonald is to create a truly transformative and innovative series of agendas in and around archaeology. Of course, the species and applications of new archaeological science that we can hardly dream of yet, but also the next generation of archaeological theory, of ideas and ways of transforming our field. And that's what Cambridge has been historically so good at. And that is the, I would say at present, slightly underpopulated intellectual ground of the Western world that the McDonald and Cambridge can help to revivify. With our laboratories, our time for thinking, slightly hollow laugh there at the end of the Lent term, but in theory we have an awful lot of people with a lot of time to do a lot of free blue skies thinking. And our resources, we're an epicenter, superbly positioned to lead in this role. As Graham's described it, the research arm of the Division of Archaeology. Yes, indeed. Though all of us, I would emphasise, in the Cambridge archaeological community, in fact collectively embody that remit in challenge throughout our lives, in or out of the McDonald Institute. An international, research-leading institution for a new 21st century global archaeology and deep history of our planet and its people. That, most definitely. Thank you.
I was going to try and draw us to a close. There is no way in which I can encapsulate what has been happening this afternoon. Many of us have not heard elements of all of this before. Putting it all together on this occasion to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the McDonald seems to me to be, as Chris suggested, enormously important in trying to keep our own memories alive. If there are things that you want to add to this, I'm sure there will be an opportunity to do so. But we've also now, for the first time, heard Cyprian's manifesto, at least first time for me, and it all sounds enormously exciting. Could you give yourselves and the speakers a final round of applause?